When women support each other, great things happen. Join myself and FCC for Connecting Women in Agriculture, a free 4-part virtual event series celebrating our contributions to the industry and sharing insights to overcome challenges. Each of these 4 sessions highlight a different expert and topic. Gain strategies to help you through adversity, get tips for managing your farm finances, delve into HR practices for family-owned farms, and get advice for transition planning and navigating change. Don't miss your chance to connect. Register today at fcc.ca/events. Hi, I'm Caitlin Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman Podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman Podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Rural Woman Podcast. Today you'll meet Kim Ross. Kim is a 5th-generation farm girl with a 130,000 square foot no-till garden. Kim sells the vegetables she grows using sustainable agriculture practices to food producers and consumers alike. She focuses on growing with the ecosystem, so her growing plots do not need to be watered and there are very little pressure from weeds. This minimizes the physical inputs that growing food typically involves, so her vegetables are highly competitive in a challenging marketplace. I had such a great chat with Kim, and if you are listening to this at the time it's released around the December mark, I kind of get the itch that I wish it was nicer outside. It snowed a couple times and I'm already thinking about what I want to put in my garden. So I hope this does the same for you and gives you the inspiration of your new growing year. Before we get to our interview with Kim, if you are listening to this again at the time that it's coming out, we are doing some amazing 5th anniversary giveaways over on the Rural Woman Podcast Instagram page. So we have a $250 gift card that we are giving away, as well as we are buying you coffee. So make sure you head on over to Instagram and check out the Rural Woman Podcast and give us a follow over there and stay up to date with all the things that we are doing to say thank you to the amazing listeners of the podcast and continuing to celebrate our 5th anniversary. Without further ado, my friends, let's get to this week's episode with Kim. Kim, welcome to the Rural Woman Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me.
It's so nice to see you again. And I get to say again because I got to meet you in real life at the Advancing Women in Agriculture Conference, the AFSC awards ceremony the day before the conference started. So it was really great to see you then. And it's good to see your smiley face today.
Awesome. I'm glad to be here.
So Kim, for the listeners who are unfamiliar with you, give us your background, tell us who you are, where you're from, and how you got your start in agriculture.
I am proud to be a 5th-generation farm girl on a centennial farm in northern Alberta near Manville. It's a tiny little town that my farm is closest to. I grew up, it was a mixed farm, so Dad had beef cattle and grains as well. So I grew up riding on the combine or on the swather with him, and I preferred the plants. My sister loved the animals. I was all about the plants. I wanted to know how was he planting them? Why was he putting fertilizer on them? And then everything to do surrounding the plants that was a part of our farm. And it was fascinating for me. I ended up going to university for genetics, and my goal was to do agricultural genetics in crop research. But I kind of got waylaid doing cancer research, genetics. And I did that until I had children. And of course, that kind of changes the whole trajectory of life. And once I had kids, I started doing photography and I started growing our own food. And I found out very quickly I don't have a green thumb that my grandma and my mom had, because growing up on the farm, of course, being a daughter, I was in the pea patch. I was picking the peas, I was weeding, I was pulling the potato bugs off the potatoes and sticking them in gasoline back then. Probably not something we would recommend to do nowadays, but that's what we were doing on the farm. And yeah, those kinds of things stuck with me, and I wanted my kids to have that experience. So I went out to the back 40 and I plowed up a garden space. And I brought my kids out with me, and they played in the forest, or they came and helped me picking the peas or eating the peas, mostly eating what was growing in the garden. But I discovered very quickly I have a black thumb. For every plant that I actually got to live in the garden, there was probably 3 dead ones in the compost pile. And I wanted to learn how to do that better. So that was pretty much where I got my start in doing regenerative ag.
Very cool. And I find it, the childhood that people have on multi-generational farms, some of them sound so similar, and then others can sound completely opposite from one another. Do you have any funny stories, or what are some of your fondest memories from being in the garden with your mom or your grandmother with their green thumbs versus maybe your black thumb?
My black thumb. For me, it was the connection between generations. So one of my favorite activity was either one of my grandparents coming. My grandpa farmed with my dad, so I saw him every single day. I didn't necessarily see my grandma, but my grandma would come out and she would take us all berry picking, and she would drive her car right into the berry bush because she was quite short. And then we would get up on the car or the back of the truck, whatever happened to be there, and we would pick. And my dad would, with baler twine, he would make us a belt to tie the pail onto us so that we wouldn't spill the berries. And we would go out and we would pick berries. And then same for potato picking day. I loved it because my whole extended family would come out and we all had our division of jobs that we had to do. And it was or planting potatoes, picking potatoes, whatever the big job was. And that was a part that I really, really loved, that connection to the different generations of the family. And then when you're out there working, you're listening to the stories of how your grandpa did this when he was little, or what funny memory that grandma had growing up on her farm that was nearby the farm that I grew up on, or how grandpa had planted the trees that were shading us while we were cutting the potato pieces up to seed them, right? Those are things that they really resounded with me as a child growing up on a multi-generational farm, and I loved it. Sometimes there were cousins there, sometimes there were uncles and aunts, and it was just that huge connection to family that really stayed with me, and I wanted to share that with my children, even though the farm is very different now than what it was back then, right? So
And what do you think it was back then? You had mentioned that your sister was definitely more leaning towards the animal side of things. What was it for you that brought you the interest in plants?
I think it was just a natural curiosity about plants. Plants are cool. I mean, they're so weird, and they're the only organism on the world that doesn't need to be fed and doesn't have to, like, they generate their own food. They don't need feet to move around. They don't need limbs. They just do everything self-sufficient, self-contained where they are. And you can plant the same plant and get 5 different plants out of that same variety, and they'll have different yields and different results than when you first put them in the ground. And why was that? Why did they do that? Like, it was just, to me, fascinating. When I was in high school, I learned about Mendel's peas and his genetic research into different pea populations and the F1 generations and how all that came together. And it was just something that has always been fascinating for me. And to come back to my roots, to move home back onto the farm, and to be able to do this and play with the plants, it's cool for me. It's fun. It's not work. It's really neat.
So you mentioned that the farm that you are on looks very different from the farm that you grew up on. So talk to me about coming back to the farm and making it your own.
Oh, well, when I was in high school, the day high school ended, the very next day, I was out of here. There was no way this girl was staying in this backwards hick of a town, right? Like, and then I moved abroad and I was abroad for 10 years and I couldn't wait to get home. Like, I couldn't get here fast enough. Every summer I would come and I would bring the kids and we would spend 6 or 8 weeks on the farm. And it was the best place in the world. And it was cool for me to see that full circle come around of where I couldn't wait to get out of there because, farmers were backwards, at least when I was 18 years old. I had two brothers. My brothers would be the farmers. Turns out my brothers didn't want to farm. My sister wanted to do the animals and I wanted to do the plants. So it's been a neat full circle to watch how that has all come out into play, and that my sister lives on the homestead and I have my plants on a different quarter. So it's really neat to see how we're connecting the fifth generation back to everybody who started the farm. It's smaller than what it was when my dad had it and when my grandpa was farming as well, but it's back to the size where it was when my great great grandfather came here originally. So I think it's a really unique thing to have as a history, right? To have as a childhood, to be that fifth generation on a centennial farm. How many people get that opportunity? And for me to be able to offer it to a chance for there to be a sixth generation, I think that's amazing.
So tell us more about your plants and your side of the operation and where you started, how you started Rossdale Farms to where that is today.
So it's actually a really funny story because I do have a black thumb. I tend to kill more things than I ever keep alive. In 2018, of course, I read everything on the internet of how to garden because I figured the internet was smarter than what my mom and my grandma had ever done. And I was trying all kinds of things. I had hugelculture hills. I had permaculture. I was growing indeterminate tomatoes in 5-gallon buckets because I was going to bring them home and grow them in my basement all winter long. So we always had fresh tomatoes, not thinking about all the insects that would come home with those tomatoes, and that you can't actually grow long term in potting soil without trying some kind of food program for those plants, because there is no nutrition in potting soil. There is in regular soil, but not in potting soil. And I had potting soil in buckets outside. I had planted 75 tomato plants. By the time we got to June, I'd killed 51 of those 75 tomato plants. I wanted to grow peas, so I threw 8 pounds of seeds in the ground in the hopes that something would grow. I had tried everything that you shouldn't do in a garden. I was doing it, and I was doing it very, very well. But then in 2018, I had planted my garden 3 times that year because I'm a bit stubborn and a bit thick-skulled. I was doing this, and there was no way that wasn't going to happen. I planted my garden, and then we got this horrific thunderstorm that dropped an inch of rain in 20 minutes. And I happened to be on the north side of the Vermilion River Valley with a south-facing slope. So when that inch of rain came in 20 minutes, it washed every one of those seeds that I had planted down to the bottom of the hill. And me being me, I planted that whole garden again, and another thunderstorm came and washed all those seeds down that hill yet again. So this time I was out of seeds. I had to go find more seeds. I planted it a third time, and this time it stayed. And then I had killed off more than half of my tomato plants. Hardly anything was growing properly when we got a hailstorm, yet another thunderstorm. Hail came, 10 minutes of hail, completely decimated my entire garden. There was nothing left. The only thing I got off that garden were a few carrots and a few potatoes. Everything else was shredded by the hail, but the hail didn't get the insects, and the mold got to because the hail had cut open every vegetable. So what I ended up doing, I was frustrated. I Googled garden help, and I got connected with the University of Saskatchewan, which has a horticulture outreach program. So they teach people how to garden on the Canadian prairies, because this is a very unique climate. Most of the garden help, when you go online, it's from the southern United States or it's from Europe. So the climates are very different. They're much more humid than what we have here, is a big one for us, right? So I went there, I got my Master Gardener certificate. And once I got into that, I fell in love with plants all over again, but this time vegetables rather than our cash crops that we have in Canada. And I started growing. I heard about no-till and regenerative horticulture. When I first heard about it, I thought it was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. I actually interrupted class and I told the woman, like, you're crazy. This is nuts. I don't know a single person who's ever done this or is doing this. And she's like, just trust me. And I couldn't. I went home and I wandered around for 2 months in my garden that was completely decimated and useless. And I was driving down a road past our farm, and I remembered as a child going down there, there were drifts of dirt in the ditch because it was on the west side of the farm. And I remember those vividly because my mom never allowed us to go in there and play. And I really wanted to go play in that dirt because it looked cool. But it dawned on me at that moment when I was driving down that same location that we were doing no-till and low-till in agriculture. And we'd been doing it for 30 or more years because my dad switched to low-till when I was in school. And I remember once he switched, those dirt drifts stopped happening. They weren't there anymore. We weren't losing the topsoil like we did when dad was tilling all the time. And when that stubble got left on the field, the dirt's not moving like it was. And it finally dawned on me that in agriculture, we're doing this. So why in horticulture are we still 50 years behind the times? Why are we still wanting that beautiful black soil that we're rototilling and pulverizing? Why do we want it? So I came back to my garden and this tells you how like I wasn't really that convinced because I got enough mulch for my garden in the back of my minivan. My garden's 26,000 square feet. You're supposed to put 6 inches of mulch over the whole thing. And I carried the mulch home in my minivan, which I don't recommend because I'm still vacuuming it out. It took me years to get rid of the wood chips out of the back of my minivan. But I put it down in one corner, and the next spring was really hot and really, really dry. We had no rain for 6 weeks. We were pulling 30 degrees in April. And where I had mulched, the soil was cool to the touch. It was full of moisture and it was soft. I didn't have to chisel in my garden shovel to plant my strawberries. But where there was no mulch, it was hard as rock. It was dry, and I could pick up the soil and sprinkle it on the wind and it blew away. So for me, that was remarkable. Like the difference between when I put that mulch down in the fall to the following spring, it made that much difference in the soil on a 30-degree day. What would it do over my whole entire garden for all of summer if I left it like that? So I got busy and I converted my whole entire garden to no-till that spring. It took me 6 weeks of digging in the dirt and of flinging straw onto the garden to get it prepped before I even planted it. It took me 6 weeks of work before I planted it, and I have not looked back since. I would never, ever go back to traditional gardening.
And all coming from the person who stuck up their hand in class and said, that will never work here.
I was not convinced at all. And it's funny because my dad has been a farmer his whole life. Us kids always tease him that he has dirt for blood because he can make anything grow. He can take care of any kind of animal, build whatever we needed on the farm. And my dad followed me around and he's like, this is never going to work, Kim. What are you going to do with all this straw at the end of the season? Like, where are you going to put it? And I'm like, I'm going to try it, Dad. I'm going to try and see what happens. And by the end of the season, Dad was out there with his farmer friends showing them how cool it was that my potatoes grew in the straw instead of the soil. And he was out there stealing the corn cobs because I actually had corn. And yeah, it was really neat to see how it wasn't just me that needed to be convinced. It was my dad as well. And because both of us were, I mean, he was fourth generation farm. I was fifth generation farm. We know how plants grow, but to switch something so completely, it was a really neat experience to go through and share that with my dad while I was doing it.
Yeah. So for the folks that are listening who are really unfamiliar what a no-till garden practice would look like when we're talking about no-till or low-till, when we come to production agriculture, in a sense, there's different ways of doing it. But when we're looking at it in let's say, a smaller scale of gardening. Can you give us the basics of what that looks like?
So for me, there's really three parts to it. And no-till, it's known as no-till, but it's also known as weed-free, drought-free, or drought-resistant garden. It's called no-dig gardening, no-work gardening. There's so many different names for it, but really it's taking those regenerative agricultural practices and putting them to work in our garden spaces. So the three pieces that for me that are really important is the first one is we stop disturbing our soil in any way, shape, or form. That means we no longer till it. We don't move our rows around. We don't walk over our rows where we're growing. We dedicate a space to growing and we leave it there. And that's our space for however long we have our garden in that space. We're not using chemicals. I'm 100% chemical free. I'm not certified organic because it's more paperwork than I can handle. But I'm 100% chemical free. No fertilizers, no herbicides, no pesticides are needed. I don't even miss having the ability to use those in my garden space. And then the second part for me is mulching. You can think of what mulch does to soil like if you had a pot of water boiling on the stove. If you left that water with no lid on it, what would happen to the water in the pot? It would boil away. If you put a lid on that pot, then what would happen to the water? The water stays in the pot. It just goes through its cycle back and forth, right? And we want to do the same thing with our soil. We want to put a lid on the soil to stop that water evaporation happening, especially on the prairies where we live, because we have really dark soils here, which heat up really quickly with the summer sun, and we're losing all that moisture that we happen to finally get. My county's gone drought the past 3 of 4 years, so it's difficult to keep water on that garden in the first place. Putting that mulch is going to seal it in. The other thing the mulch does is it suppresses the weed growth. So if you are like me and do not see the finer points or the enjoyment in pulling weeds out of a garden, especially thistle and stinging nettle like I had everywhere, the mulch suppresses those weeds. It keeps them from growing in the first place. So right away, you have prevented the weeds from growing into the garden. You're conserving water by putting a lid on that boiling pot of water, and you're keeping the water where the plants need it. Because I'm on the hill, I was also losing my topsoil. As soon as I put that mulch down, the soil's staying where I need it to be. I need it to be underneath the plants. So putting that mulch down has multiple benefits, and it's huge for maintaining that garden space. And then the final component for me is soil health. Taking that soil from that dry, powdery stuff that blows away easily in the wind and improving the organic matter in it so that that soil is holding more moisture for me. If I can do that, then my garden can become drought resistant. And what happened for me is it took 3 years and my garden became drought resistant. I have not watered my garden one single time in 4 seasons, 3 of which were declared drought in my county. So that's pretty amazing to me. When you think about how much work it takes to grow a vegetable, when you're weeding it all the time, you got to rototill, you've got to water. I was on raw land. The only way I could get water to my garden is to pump it uphill 300 feet from the closest dugout. And then I had to water the whole thing by hand. Whereas for me now, I didn't even take a water pump out to pump any water at all this summer. All the water stayed in the dugout because I didn't need it. The garden stayed completely moist by itself. If I open up the mulch and put my hand in the dirt and pull it out, I can ball it up as mud, which is incredible when my pasture is burnt to a crisp and there's not one single green blade of grass in it at all. My garden is happily growing without any kind of stress to it at all. So yeah, and when you put those 3 pieces together, the first thing that starts to happen is your yields go through the roof. I used to plant 800 feet of peas for my kids. After the first year, I went down to 200 feet of peas and I was pulling the same yields. That's huge. All that pea fence, all that work of maintaining that, all those seeds, I went from 800 feet down to 200 feet. I had planted 65 celery plants because I figured that's how much I would need to put away for winter. And I got enough off 6 plants. So what do you do with it? I was standing outside handing it out like bouquets of flowers because I didn't know what to do with all my vegetables. And I ended up making my first commercial sale because I had 60 pounds of beans that I had no idea what I was going to do with. I didn't want them to go to waste. I wanted somebody to eat them. And I ended up selling them to a store. And that was my first commercial sale. I was producing enough food for myself, but then I had huge amounts of extra so I could produce an income for myself on the exact same space I already was using, but I can produce that income with no extra work involved for me whatsoever. It was a pretty wild year, 2019. I learned a good amount that summer on how to grow food. So
Are you looking to supercharge your farm business skills? Register for a Farm Credit Canada event. FCC events are designed to sharpen your management practices and build personal and professional growth. They offer in-person and virtual options, and the best part, they are free to attend. FCC Events brings experts from all areas of finance, personal development, transition, economics, and more to explore topics important to today's farm business owners and entrepreneurs. Gain practical advice, connect with peers, and get the knowledge that you need to take your operation to the next level. As a host of previous FCC events, I've personally witnessed farmers gain a deeper understanding of our industry and expand their network with folks who share the same passion and dedication to their farm businesses. I'm looking forward to heading out on the road again this winter to host the FCC Young Farmers Summit, and I hope to see you there. For more information and to check out the latest event lineup, head to fcc.ca/events or the link in today's show notes. I'm curious, when you started your garden and when you thought this is what you wanted to do, you wanted to build these memories with your kids that you had growing up with your grandparents, did you go in with the intention that you were going to produce food for other people, or was it strictly just for you and your family?
it was a happy accident that I was producing food for other people. I kept making my garden bigger and bigger because I kept running out of the food for the kids. I didn't have enough peas put away, so I would plant more peas the next season, right? I didn't have enough celery put away, so I would just grow more. And that first season of no-till, because the plants were not as stressed, the soil temperature stays 18 degrees Celsius all summer long. That's optimal temperature for garden plants. In bare soil, if it's 30-degree day, that soil could be 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. Then the plants are stressed, they're working hard. When you cover up the soil with mulch, you no longer are getting soil splashing up onto the plants, which is where your plant diseases come from. So all of a sudden, I wasn't getting powdery mildew in any melon family plant. Yeah, it was wild. The mulch is where ladybugs live. So the aphids were under control because I had a habitat for ladybugs. It was just the plants were happier and I started producing more and more food. And it turns out for me, gardening became very different than what it was before. Before, I was a slave to that garden. I weeded all day long. I watered every single night, and it wasn't fun. It was something that I had to do if I wanted that food. And when I switched to no-till, there's no weeds. So what do? You walk through your garden and you visit your plants and you learn how fast a pea goes from a bloom to a pod to a ripe pod that you can eat, right? I didn't know that before. And it's a much more intimate growing experience with those plants. And I know so much more about those plants that it gives me incentive the next season to play around with it. Well, if I can get a 4-pound cabbage, could I get a 15 or an 18-pound cabbage if I put more compost down, if I do something different? Like, how can I play around with this to make it improved? And then the added kick for me was I was generating an income for myself. My job as a photographer in COVID, I was shut down in 3 or 4 waves. How do you make money when your whole livelihood disappears overnight? And it literally did. And here I was with this garden full of vegetables that I could sell, and I could sell it online. I could reach out to people and say, hey, you want some veggies? And I could drop it off on the side of the street without having to break any of those rules that we were all subjected to, right? And then in that whole time frame, I was asked by Gardening at USask to start teaching classes because we had to do it online. So all of a sudden, my love of photography, because I have all kinds of photos of my garden. I'm putting that together in a slideshow, and pretty soon I'm teaching people how to do this. I'm writing websites, I'm maintaining social media platforms to teach people how to do this. And suddenly it's a huge part of my life. And it's really cool because it doesn't feel like work. It's something I'm already doing. And I grow 65 celery plants so that I can feed other people in addition to my family. But I was already doing that before. My yields have just gone through the roof. So I'm not doing any more work than I used to.
And I could probably guess and say that you're probably doing less work than you used to, that you're not out there having to weed and to water and do those things every single day in hopes that these plants are going to stay alive.
Exactly. Last summer, I have a 13-week growing season. That's it. 13 weeks from last frost to first frost in the fall. Last summer, 5 of those weeks, I wasn't even in my garden. Like, not one time in those 5 weeks did I walk in that garden. Was I worried that my plants were dying? Not at all. I knew that they had enough water in the soil. I knew that the weeds weren't out competing all of those plants. And I knew that I would walk back to an 18-pound cabbage and I wouldn't even have to do anything. It's a literal, I plant the plants and I can walk away from them. The only thing I go back to the garden is to harvest. And I have planned my garden now that I don't have to harvest everything all in the same week where it's crazy, crazy, crazy. I can space out my garden. I can start peas at different times so that instead of harvesting 200 feet of peas all at the same time, I may be harvesting 50 feet of peas this week, and next week I have the next 50 feet ready to go. So I have time to do that now. I have time to play and to stagger my harvests and to push those plants to what they're capable of so that it fits into my life. If I know we want to go camping on the August long weekend, there's no way my peas are going to be ripe on the August long weekend. I'm going to make sure of it so that I'm not tied to that garden. I can enjoy all of the fun things of summer that I didn't get to enjoy when I was doing traditional gardening because I was tied to that garden. I could never have left it for a week.
Right.
Everything would have been dead.
I'm curious your perspective of, for me, I can still remember on my wedding day, people coming up to me in the big white dress saying, "Where are you going to plant your garden?" Or "What are you going to plant in your garden?" And I was like, "Excuse me, what? Like, I'm not planting no garden. This is a city girl who is going to have a city life, who lives on a farm." That didn't last very long, but the gardening really didn't come. My first garden dabble was in 2019. And then in 2020, when the whole world started to garden, I was like, I want to do this more. And I look at it now, and again, very much a hobby garden. It is very much for, me to just play around in, but it is that traditional type of garden where it is labor intensive. And I do feel like I'm out there and I'm not getting to enjoy it the way that I wanted it to. When did that disconnect happen, do you think? Like, obviously the no-till garden or the low method, we've been doing it in agriculture for many, many years. But when did that switch to it being more labor intensive and having to be there and use all of these resources? From your perspective, when did that switch happen?
I don't know that it's entirely happened because we still grow the way our grandmothers taught us. That's all we know. And I think that what's happened over time is that we don't have single family incomes anymore, where like one parent is working and the other parent is at home with the kids and can maintain that garden. That it just stopped happening. Mom had to work. Mom didn't have time to spend all day, every day fighting those weeds in the garden and taking care of that garden the way that grandma did, or the way that grandma had taught her to do it, or to get out there and pick the Saskatoons, or to grow your own strawberries because the kids love strawberries all winter long, right? I think what just happened is we got so busy that we couldn't maintain a garden like that. But other things have also happened. Our rain events have changed over time. When I was a little girl, I remember Dad not being able to work in the field for 3 days because we were getting a gentle rainfall over 3 days. We don't really get that anymore. We get torrential downpours and thunderstorms, and then 2 days later, it's bone dry again and they're back out at work. It's very different. Our climate is a little bit different than what it was when my grandma was gardening. Our soils are more depleted in the garden space because chances are the garden space that you have on the farm is the same one that grandma had. and grandma used, right? So it's not producing as well as it did when grandma was doing it. What are some of the things that we can do to change that? The other thing that really changed gardening for me, and I saw it in my own numbers, it used to be a senior thing. Most of the students that came to my classes were over the age of 65. And then during COVID, gardening went up by 600%. It was crazy. As a commercial grower of vegetables, I had a hard time finding seeds during COVID because so many people wanted to do those backyard gardens that those seed sales went through the roof. Sales went up for garden supplies 600% during COVID, which is insane. That's a huge number that most businesses could only wish to have over a period of 10 years, right? And then my numbers changed to where the vast majority of the people who are taking my classes are much younger, so 25 to 40 years old. And I think a lot of that is you want to feed your kids good food. You go to the grocery store and one teeny tiny cabbage that's full of brown spots is $10. You can buy a package of cabbage seed for $1. Throw them in the ground and you have 10 of them instead of what you just invested in the grocery store for something that's going to go bad in 2 days. I also think there's a huge push for farm to table. Where is your food coming from? Is it coming from here, or was that cabbage grown in a foreign country and then transported here? I think all of these things are coming together and creating this perfect storm that people want to know where their food is coming from. They want to have that participation in it. And if I can provide them a method to do it without having to slave away in the garden all summer long, but to be able to do it as a fun side hobby, maybe a day or two a week, it makes a big difference, right?
I know that you know this, and I know that a lot of people listening know this, but the mental health benefits of being outside and touching dirt or soil or smelling like compost and mulch and all of the things, it does something to you.
It absolutely does. This is scientifically proven. You can go on Google and type into Google the healing power of plants. Surgery, people who have just had surgery, if they put plants in the recovery room, people who have just had surgery need less drugs to cope with that surgery. Their recovery is much quicker than if they have an abstract painting in that same room. Like, it's crazy. And this is scientific study and scientific proof. There's doctors in some countries now that are giving green prescriptions, where the prescription is get outside and go grow something and get your hands in dirt. For me, when we get that time change and it is dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and it is minus 40 and the snow is blowing, it does something to me. I'm grouchy. I'm not happy like I am in the summertime. But to put me in my greenhouse when it's 4 o'clock and it's dark and the winds are blowing and it's cold and I've got grow lights over the top of me and my hands are in dirt, completely different outlook on life, right? It's amazing to me how very powerful it is. And to look back at, when I killed off 51 of my 75 tomato plants, I didn't really feel good about myself. I know that my grandma wouldn't have been very impressed with my gardening skills. So it helps build self-confidence. It increases your physical abilities because you're outside doing stuff instead of sitting in the shade or the air conditioning. It improves your mental health and it improves your nutrition. We talk about food security. If you live in a small community and your grocery store is 1 or 2 aisles big, yeah, I love going to a grocery store in the city simply to visit and look at all the selection that everybody in the city gets. And it blows my mind. How do you choose when you have so many choices compared to me? Like, just coffee. How do you pick your favorite coffee when in my grocery store there's 2? That's it. But yeah, it's a great thing to get outside. Take your kids, get your grandparents out on a lawn chair, get your parents involved, and have fun with it.
Yeah. And that it should be fun. And, you're talking about the self-confidence. This year was the very first year that I successfully grew a cob of corn that looked like a cob of corn.
Isn't that fun?
It was the saddest little corn, but it was edible and we could eat it. And I'm excited already for next year of what I'm going to do differently because I am going to have a full, beautiful cob of corn
eventually.
Yeah. I'll tell you what to do. Don't plant it in a straight row. Plant it in a block. Corn is wind pollinated, so it needs to blow.
We have all of the wind here. So
Well, you do on the prairies, but if you just plant a single row, there's nothing for it to blow into. So make sure you plant corn in a block, not a straight row. But yeah, it's when I pulled off my 18-pound cabbage. And when I first started, like my cabbages were full of holes. And if I even got the plant right to the end of the season and actually had leaves still on the plant because the worms had annihilated it, I was doing really good. And to pull off last year, I pulled off an 18-pounder. This year, the weather was it was a challenging year for any gardener, and I only got a 15-pound cabbage. But when I look in the seed catalog and the average size of that variety is 3 to 4 pounds, man, I feel like I have a superpower. Same for compost. When I can get my compost pile up to 70 degrees and I know I'm killing every weed seed that's in there, it feels like I have a superpower. It's really cool. And it's really, for me, it's really addictive to be able to do that myself and to share it with other people and to teach them how to do it. And then have people send me a message and say, Kim, my compost pile's at 60. It's neat. It's fun, right? And it does great things for self-esteem, mental health, for all of it. Finding that joy and contentment in life, even when life is hard and it's a struggle and cabbages in the grocery store cost $10 instead of two, right? Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I want to dive into the teaching aspect because I'm sitting here saying, I want you to brain dump everything you know about this on me. But for listeners who are also feeling that, tell us more about the offerings of teaching that you have.
Right. So I take what I've known and I've written a class. It's about 2 hours long, and I travel to different places around the prairies and I teach gardeners how to do no-till gardening. I love to go places and meet different gardeners and to hear the stories about their gardening, their weather patterns, even Vegreville. It's 45 minutes straight west of me. They have a 60 some day growing season. Their first frost, their last frost, it's so much shorter than mine. And I live 45 minutes straight across from them. Why? Right? Like it's wild. And I love being able to talk to those people, but I travel to wherever they want to host me. And a lot of times it's county ag extension offices will host me to come out and teach gardening to people who live in there. Sometimes it is a town or a community, a gardening group, a horticulture group, an ag society, whoever it is, they have me come out and I teach them. This past year, I started doing something new and it was really fun for me. And I wish that I'd thought of it when I converted my garden 6 years ago. But I go out and I teach my class in the morning. So we're in a hall. I'm on the computer with a projector and I show people why no-till works. We talk about soil science. We talk about your ecosystem that exists in your garden because it's not something I ever considered when I was planting a garden, that around that little fluff on top of the carrot is a whole ecosystem. And if I pay attention to it, my carrot's going to get bigger. But I teach that in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we go out to someone's traditional garden and the whole class gets their hands dirty and we convert that garden from traditional to no-till, start to finish. So by the time that we leave, whoever's garden it is gets to plant directly into that no-till garden and gets to take that garden through to watching it grow. And it's really cool. I wish that I thought to have people come and help me convert my garden because it's a lot of work. But yeah, it's really fun. And people get hands-on experience so they can go home and they can be a lot more confident. When I've converted my first garden, I had no idea what I was doing. There was no information online. There was nobody that I knew doing it. So to be able to go out to a garden with 60 or 100 people and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to plant your carrot seeds. Here's how we're going to plant your cabbage transplant when there's 6 inches of straw on top of your garden. How do you do it? And I get to show them exactly how to do it. And by the time we're done, that whole garden is converted start to finish. And they go home with a confidence that they can do it themselves because they've just done it that afternoon. So yeah, I do it wherever someone wants me to come and host a class. It's really fun. I am working at recording my class and getting it online off my website so people can just take it at their own leisure. And then if they find me close to them, they can come out to a demo class. And then I also teach classes through Gardening at USask with the University of Saskatchewan. I teach a number of different classes, not just no-till. Things like garden planning. How do you plan a hail-proof garden so that you're not like me and you lose your entire garden in a single year? You can do it. You can provide a garden. If you get a hailstorm at the end of the week or the last week in June, you can still get a garden off at the end of August. So yeah, I think it's the best part of what I do is to get to go out and talk to other gardeners and share all of the mistakes. It's really what I share when I teach is what not to do. Because if there was a mistake to make, I made it.
I love that. And I love it when two people with a similar interest come into a room and they can nerd out about absolutely everything, and completely nerding out about gardening right now. And I'm looking outside and I'm like, I don't want to go out there. It's, after harvest. I'm inspired now to go plant my garlic that I have been sitting on. Need to get that done before the ground freezes.
You certainly do. You should get it in there now.
Yes. Kim, for the listeners who would like to connect with you and learn more about your teachings, where can they find you online?
So I have a website. It's rossdalefarm.ca. And then I also have social media. I'm most active on Facebook right now. So it is, if you just search for Rossdale Farm, no-till gardening, you will find me on Facebook as well.
Perfect. And I will link those in the show notes so people can find you and connect with you, and keep an eye out for, and make sure you let us know when all of your classes are online and all of the things are available, and we can have you back on here.
There's actually a link on my website under education. If you go there, I try and keep an active list of where I will be teaching soon. Most of my classes are spring and fall because that's when it's most useful. That's when people can get their gardens converted. And then, the online class, hopefully they'll be able to take whenever they want to from the comfort of their own home when it's minus 40 and they're dreaming of getting their hands dirty.
Exactly. They're dreaming of all of the plants and all of the no-till goodness.
That's the cool part about no-till. I don't get dirty anymore. My hands stay clean because it's all straw, right? Even when I go and pull potatoes, I'm not digging in the soil. I'm just pulling the plant back and my potatoes are sitting right there in the straw. It's pretty cool.
Like, my nail scrubber is absolutely disgusting after I come out of the garden. So you're speaking my language here. So
yes, I actually have a photo when I converted my last garden to no-till. It's my cabbage patch. It's 103,000 square feet and has 9,000 feet of growing bed in it. And I took a photo of myself because I had not worked with bare soil in 5 years. And there I was, completely filthy dirty. And I couldn't get over the difference of, it surprised me that I got so dirty gardening. And I'm like, wait a minute, I used to get this dirty all of the time because I was working directly in that dirt. And now I don't. I very rarely get dirty. My nails will get dirty because I still love to stick my hands right into that. Whether it's my compost or my soil, I still get in and get quite close with my soil just because it's fun. But I'm not coming home with dirt in my hair and a dirty face and have to change my clothes before I walk in my house because it's a completely different growing environment than what I had before. So it was pretty neat to see that difference.
Kim, my last question for you is, what is the most rewarding part about being a rural woman for you?
I think for me right now, it's getting to share the experiences that I had growing up, because it's pretty different compared to someone who's growing up even in a small town. You learn different things. You learn a different work ethic. Your day starts earlier and goes later. And being able to share that, the stories that I share in my class of what it was like to be the second daughter with two brothers on a farm and where I was and what I had to do and the things that I learned from my dad and my grandpa. And I think it's such a rewarding thing to be able to have and to have that experience. There's not a lot of people who have that connection to the land. I live where my great-great-grandfather came to Alberta. I live right there. And it's really, how many people get to have that connection to someone they've never ever met? I mean, my great-great-grandfather he arrived in 1906. There's no way I would have ever met him. Absolutely. But yet I can see his tools and I can see his mark on the land. And same for my great-grandfather, who I also never met. It's pretty cool.
It's very cool. And you get to show hopefully the 6th generation, all of that too.
Oh, I'm hopeful. I have a daughter who is in horticulture at the University of Saskatchewan, so it's pretty cool.
So cool. Kim, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer, and admin support from Kim & Co. Online. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Riedner from Happiness by the Acre and Carrie Munven from Laystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at The Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story. Did you know that you can get this same great episode of the Rural Woman Podcast ad-free? I get it. Listening to ads during a podcast isn't always my favorite either. But in order to keep the lights and coffee pot on here at the Rural Woman Podcast Studios, they are necessary. I am so grateful to each and every one of my sponsors, but if you yourself would like to skip the ads while supporting the show, consider joining me over on Patreon. Patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast get ad-free episodes starting at Tier 5 on their podcast player of choice each week, plus some other great benefits. Find out more by heading to the link in today's show notes to learn how you can become a patron through Patreon.